So today on the podcast, we continue our story of Disney artist Mary Blair as Walt begins to explore ideas for feature films that will be released after the war. In our last episode, we looked at Mary's trips as a Disney artist to Mexico and then Cuba, specifically to create more material for CIAA-sponsored animated features designed to encourage a wartime spirit of hemispheric unity between North, Central, and South America. But by 1944, the war effort at the studio was beginning to change, with a hope that the Allies might find victory in the next year or so. Inside of this, the production schedule of the studio changed as well, as fewer wartime films would be needed and as the Disney brothers explored ways to move the studio back toward general entertainment. In Mary's life, the shift during these years was clear. She was now a central artist who helped visually plan large projects for Walt. And this here is where we pick up our story today. While Mary focused on projects assigned to her by Walt, thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., her husband Lee worked his way up a different organizational ladder. He worked with a group that made military training films, with some elements presented as live action, others as animation. Initially, Lee was more focused on animation, while others, also recruited from Hollywood, worked more with live action. But Lee quickly learned how to move between the two different modes of production. Discounting the 16mm footage he had shot with a handheld camera on the first Disney Good Neighbor trip, this was his introduction to studio-based live-action cinematography. He observed how shots were assembled, how the camera was positioned, and how sets were dressed and lit. He also saw how filmmakers used materials to suggest rather than depict complex scenes to avoid the cost of elaborate sets. For one sequence, his division needed to create a shot of actor Robert Stack flying in a Grumman torpedo bomber. So writer and actor Bernie Rubin had them bring over a bomber, park it in front of the photoscience lab, got some smoke machines and a wind machine back of that, so the clouds were flying by old Robert Stack in his plane, and it looked like he was up in the air, which he wasn't at all. For Lee, it was an eye-opening experience. Animation was the illusion that drawings could move, and live action, when well made, was an illusion that actors were involved in activities that, if well staged, mostly existed in the viewer's imagination. Lee paid attention to how things were created by the set designers, and in particular, how the crew used inexpensive items to construct props and sets that would appear believable on screen. By the end of 1943, Lee oversaw the animation unit, which included roughly 30 artists. But also, when he had time, he was teaching himself how to produce live-action training sequences with a modest budget. In this, his skills as well were expanding. During these same weeks, Mary's life in California was moving in a different direction. Whereas many Disney artists continually look to the future, how films and gallery shows might elevate their careers, Mary always included her past. In 1943, she sat down for an interview with a member of the high school paper at Live Oak, the school from which years ago she had graduated. She also arranged for an exhibit of her Good Neighbor art to travel from the Los Angeles County Museum up to San Jose State College, a university she had attended for 2 years. This exhibition would include not only her Disney art, but some of her personal pieces. The local paper would refer to this as one of the most unique collections of paintings to be exhibited there. Beyond this, she made regular trips home to see both her parents still living in Morgan Hill and her sisters. At the studio, animators and other artists noticed her more, understanding that her work had captured the attention of Walt. These artists also came to understand her unique style. Mary tended to mix neutral and intense colors together, creating unique pairings. She also placed two shades of similar colors side by side, a forest made of two shades of blue, curtains made from two shades of brown, and so on. Mary Blair was the first person I ever knew who could combine pink and orange and purple and yellow together without letting it become garish, said background painter Claude Coates. These were combinations that, based on color theory concepts taught at most art schools, shouldn't work. But Mary found ways to elegantly combine these colors, narrowing in on exact values, so their juxtaposition produced images that viewers found pleasing. Animator Frank Thomas said, "Her use of color was outstanding and very personal. She was the first artist I knew of to have different shades of red next to each other. You just didn't do that, but Mary made it work." As Mary herself explained, some at the studio, because of these unique color pairings, started to call her Marijuana Blair because of the ideas she dreams up. Even though she was pushing studio art in new directions, she didn't see herself as a trailblazer. She didn't do much talking about art influences, explained Disney artist Joe Grant. She just seemed to be in her own private world. She was extremely talented, and she'd come up with extraordinary things. Her sense of color and the way she blocked out things. Nor did Mary spend time in local galleries to note trends in modern art. In her off hours, she liked to relax with friends. She made a point to limit movie talk outside of the studio. In her own words, she tried to keep a social life, free from as much professionalism as possible, but it always seeps in. She swam, she played badminton, she still designed some of her own clothes, even though good materials during wartime were hard to find. If it was warm, she might lay out on her deck and read a book. She loved to sunbathe, Joe Grant recalled. She got the deepest brown you could imagine. Though she was technically grouped with the other concept artists, she was often a department of one. She would visually develop material for a film, even while story artists were still arranging the story. My sketches were usually made as the storyboards were developed, she said. Most importantly, she worked one-on-one with Walt often directly explaining assignments to her. She learned to navigate Walt's moods. One could always sense when Walt didn't like something, she said. At those times, I would just keep quiet. But Walt was one of her biggest supporters. Though neither Walt nor Mary examined the basis for their growing closeness, their backgrounds contained some obvious similarities. Both had grown up in near poverty. They had experienced early childhood in towns far from Hollywood. Walt largely in Marceline, Missouri, and Mary in McAlester, Oklahoma. They then moved to larger cities. Walt's family moved to Kansas City, Mary's to a town just outside San Jose. Only as adults in their young 20s had they come to Los Angeles. In this, Mary's values, which were often centered around her extended family, were similar to those of Walt. Because of this, Mary was able to bring a sense of contemporary art into Walt's life at the studio. Walt found coldness in much of modern art, as though it were an intellectual exercise, to create novelty often for the sake of creating something that on its surface was simply new. Mary's work also looked to color and shape to create an original way to view the world, but Walt warmed to it, perhaps because beneath the visual novelty, Mary's watercolors presented a worldview that aligned with that of Walt himself. Even on the surface of her paintings, colors expressed warm emotions, and figures were often rounded, visual strategies that gave her work a sense of innocence and charm. In contrast, Lee had arranged his skills to communicate the complexities of contemporary culture, with an eye toward an academic audience and toward prestige, while Mary more often used her sophisticated skills to present scenes of childhood wonder, family warmth, and to explore the beauty of the natural world. In this, the final aims of her art were very much in line with the final aims of a Disney film. For the Disney studio, the turning point in their war-related work was the start of 1944. In 1943, Disney had produced or partially produced over 120 training films for the Navy and the Army, with topics ranging from aircraft landing gear to bombing procedures. It would still produce a few films for both the Navy and the Army in 1944, a total of just over 20. But by this point, Disney had already covered most of the key training topics. Moreover, additional training films that needed to be created were done by government film units such as the Naval Production Center, now partially overseen by Lee. The reduction in government-related work meant that Disney artists could begin to focus more on films for a general audience. It also meant that artists at the studio felt less connected to the war effort. To compensate for this loss, Disney artists collectively explored other ways to contribute to the war. Initially, Pruitt Carter, an arts instructor, arranged for Disney employees to visit nearby veterans' hospitals and draw portraits of servicemen. From that, Disney artists together saw a way they might better lift the spirits of servicemen, both those recovering in hospitals and those stationed at nearby bases. They would create a USO-style variety camp show to be performed at military installations in Southern California. Disney artists would be the performers, the musicians, and the dancers, but they also produced the show. Mary herself worked on the costumes. Layout artists Ken Anderson and Yale Gracie worked on set design. Others handled makeup and lighting. During its first few performances, the camp show was relatively small. Artists drove their own cars out to local bases, but then things changed. The show became larger and had a following within the service. It got sort of famous, animator Ward Kimball explained. This led us to putting on a different type of show. Some of us would draw pictures while the band played. We got can-can dancers. It kept getting bigger and bigger. You name it, we had it. Even a Salvation Army band and a one-act play called Curse You, Jack Dalton. This play was modeled after the one-act melodrama, The Drunkard, which had been performed at the Theater Mart in downtown Los Angeles, the venue where Mary had once worked as a barmaid. A typical Disney camp show started with a recent Goofy cartoon, either Tiger Trouble or How to Play Football, then opened into a vaudeville variety show. Animator Art Scott presented a magic act. Animator Bob Youngquist juggled balls and bowling pins. Animator Bill Justice offered a comic bit as a sketch artist, an act where he tried to draw a beautiful female singer on stage. His performance had a couple of variations. In the first, the audience initially couldn't see the singer. I began to outline her figure, Justice recalled. Her head would come first and then a line or two suggesting her shape. The audience soon discovered that, though the singer was fully clothed, Justice was drawing her as a nude, with a come-hither yearning kinked into her smile. Once the audience started to laugh, an oversized shepherd's cane hooked Justice off stage for his risque drawing. The camp shows weren't arranged on studio time. Disney artists clocked out before stepping on a bus that would take them to a military base in San Diego or perhaps Santa Barbara. These performances were a gift that the artists made personally to support the war effort. During 1944, Walt was aware that some key artists were growing tired of the training films, the CIAA projects, and general animation that lacked the ambition and budget of pre-war Disney projects. Among those who considered leaving were Herb Ryman, who had a background in set design, and Dick Irvine, who had a background in live-action production. Both men were approached by producers at other studios. Irvine left in 1944. Ryman would stay an additional year, but he too would leave in 1945. Walt was aware that producers were also approaching Mary Blair about work elsewhere. But unlike Ryman and Irvine, Mary was content to stay with Disney. In 1944, when 20th Century Fox asked Dick Irvine to work on the film Diamond Horseshoe starring Betty Grable, they also made an offer to Mary. One of Mary's friends, Norm Ferguson, pointed out her loyalty to Walt in a memo dated July 20th. I believe Mary Blair was approached to work on it, but she turned it down. In this, Walt learned that just as he was interested in and supportive of Mary's work, Mary, too, was interested and supportive of the work of the Disney studio, even if the Disney studio was then moving through a difficult period in which it was financially unable to create the type of elaborate features it had produced before the war. Walt's next project for Mary would move the studio back toward feature production. During the past 2 years, in terms of features for a family audience, the studio had mostly focused on package features, thematically unified by a sense of place. Saludos Amigos, focused on South America, had edited live-action footage together with cartoon shorts. Each of the cartoon sections told its own story, about Donald Duck visiting Lake Titicaca, about Goofy learning to ride a horse like an Argentine gaucho, and so on, which then used a sense of place to unify them into a feature with live action. A similar strategy was being used on the Three Caballeros, mixing sections of live action with sections of animation to tell stories primarily about Mexico and South America. The combination of live action and animation lowered the overall cost of the feature. With this, the studio considered how a traditional full-length feature, one that told a single story, might be arranged by alternating between sections of live action and sections of animation. Disney animation, especially in the promotional materials, could be used to market such a film, but the live action sequences would minimize the feature's overall cost. It would also reduce the workload burden on the animation department, as Disney had lost hundreds of artists, both to the post-strike layoffs and to the war. This project would be to adapt the Uncle Remus stories for the screen, a feature that would later be called The Song of the South. The Disney Company would, decades later, remove The Song of the South from the films they re-released to theaters and home video due to concerns relating to how African Americans were presented in the live-action scenes. The initial impulse here, though, was to represent the stories of the antebellum South, specifically Georgia, in such a way they represented the region on screen. Mary's assignment, as with her trips to Latin America, was largely to create reference paintings to inspire the animated sequences and to arrange material that would frame background scenery for the live-action segments. Specifically, she was tasked with researching how animators, background painters, and set designers would present scenes whose visual presentation evoked the geography of Georgia, particularly those places associated with Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus stories. In other words, Walt was applying the same research strategy recently directed at the culture and geography of Latin America to create a film focused on the American South during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. Walt's selection of Mary for this work also revealed how deeply he was coming to rely on her skills and sensibilities. The Song of the South would largely be a live-action production, with just over 25% of the film being animated. Mary's background was entirely in animation, but one of Walt's other top concept artists, Herb Ryman, had a background in live action. Before coming to Disney, Ryman had a long career at MGM, creating sketches for historical dramas such as David Copperfield and Mutiny on the Bounty. His specific job had been to create research-centered, period-specific drawings that would then guide the production of sets. This was the exact set of skills that Disney now needed to create a realistic production of post-war Georgia. Walt also knew he was in danger of losing Ryman to another studio. But instead of sending Ryman to Georgia, Walt once again chose Mary Blair. That August, the studio made arrangements for Mary to travel by rail in a first-class roomette from Los Angeles to Atlanta to develop materials for this film. In Georgia, the studio employed Wilbur Kurtz and his wife Annie Fuller Kurtz, both of whom had served as technical advisors on a previous 19th century film set in Georgia, Gone with the Wind. They would guide Mary through the region and show her specific locations related to the Uncle Remus stories. Beyond Georgia, Disney also arranged for Mary to have an 11-day layover in the Washington, D.C. area so that she could spend some time with Lee. Before leaving California, Mary made one adjustment to her living situation. As she had a 3-story house to herself with her husband stationed indefinitely in Washington, D.C., she asked her friend Retta Scott to move in with her. "Well, I was renting a house not far away from Mary," Scott explained, "but she said that she was going down to Georgia to do research for an upcoming film." Retta Scott's move into the hillside house was not temporary, rather a permanent residence. In this, Mary was taking another step toward her bifurcated life. Her marital life became more associated with the East Coast, and a very close friend group, which functioned like a family, was the social center of her life in California. In preparing for the trip, Mary decided that her work in Georgia would follow the overall structure of the trips to Latin America, even though some cultural elements she wanted to see there had been washed away by time. "I want to know what a Georgian cotton field looks like and all about the briar patch," she said. "I want to find out about the weather and the terrain and to get the feel for Georgia for myself." Once in Georgia, Mary, guided by the Kurtzes, toured a plantation near Adairsville, as well as a dairy farm in the town where Joel Chandler Harris, author of the Uncle Remus stories, once lived. They looked at agricultural fields and open land. They walked through a grove that scholars believed partially inspired the Brer Rabbit stories. To better understand how these areas looked during the late 1800s, Mary paged through scrapbooks that the Kurtzes had collected. She went to Emory University to explore archival materials related to Joel Chandler Harris. She observed Greek Revival architecture in Roswell that defined stately Georgian homes from that period. As was her habit, she also painted while she was there, so her research simply would be a collection of photos and notes, but also a suggestion as to how the studio might represent this region in art. Many of her watercolors focused on the landscape, a few on animal characters featured in the Uncle Remus stories. In those that presented African Americans, the figures were almost always isolated. They were stooped at times with their heads held low. Some images were touched with loneliness and sorrow, very little of which made its way into the live-action sections of the Disney film. But the visual dialogue between Mary's watercolors suggested that she was pointedly aware of the hardships experienced by African Americans after the Civil War, especially compared with how the white characters in her Georgia watercolors were presented. The white characters in her paintings were often placed in elegant homes. The African American characters often outdoors by themselves, but connected to the natural world. Beyond this, her paintings of animals, central to the Uncle Remus stories, were imbued with whimsy, as though Mary was suggesting that these playful narratives were an important escape for African Americans in a world otherwise filled with hardship. After returning from Georgia, Mary attended multiple story meetings with key Disney artists, including Ken Anderson, Tee, and of course Walt. As usual, Walt asked a person from the steno pool to transcribe these meetings, with notes reading like a script for a stage play. At these meetings, Mary was mostly quiet, somewhat reserved and shy, though she was there for multiple meetings. There are only a couple of moments in which she offered comments. Both are related to how proposed changes might harm the overall narrative of the film. In many cases, she let her art speak for itself, a tactic to which some at Disney responded well, and she let Walt oversee story development for the film. Her images would largely define the color palette and the mood of the picture, particularly the animated sequences. For the most part, artists were intrigued by her work. Background painter Claude Coates explained, Mary did some early sketches on Song of the South and had a lot of good suggestions for this. I think that Walt sent her to Georgia to get the feel, and she came back with the red soil of Georgia layered into her paintings. Animator Ollie Johnston admitted that the Song of the South backgrounds were inspired by her to a certain extent. Beyond the animated sequences, Mary's work gave rise to some live-action sets as well. Walt wanted to achieve the illusion that Uncle Remus walked on the same ground with Brer Rabbit, Fox, and Bear, Ken Anderson explained. This called for a set that would look like a painted cartoon background. The set was from a small color painting by Mary Blair. As Disney didn't yet have extensive live-action facilities on their lot, this set would be built at the United Artists Studio across town. There, on Soundstage 3, designers created an indoor set that matched the color and shading of Mary Blair's painting, so that in the film's final sequence, human actors would move alongside animated characters in a world that resembled one of Mary's unique visions. But as Mary returned from Georgia in the fall of 1944, these sets and this production all lay in her future. After spending days with Lee in Washington, D.C., and taking the train across country, she settled in for another period of work. She attended meetings about the film's development and passed her concept paintings and research on to animators, layout artists, and background painters who would adapt her ideas toward production. At this point, Americans in general were becoming hopeful that the war was slowly coming to an end. There were still many months, perhaps a year left or so of the fighting, but the Allies had liberated Paris, and some German troops in Boulogne and Calais had surrendered. The European conflict was leading toward a battle in which Hitler's troops would attempt to divide the Allies and disrupt their supply lines, but that too was in the future. The social highlight of the fall was an elaborate wrap party at the Oakmont Country Club for the Three Caballeros, a feature that had been in production for over 2 years. Mary once more volunteered as chairperson to organize the event, creating a party with a strong Latin American theme and decorations. Tickets were sold at the studio, priced at $2 per person, with the party described as a trip to all of the places presented in the first 2 Good Neighbor pictures, and also to places considered for the third. The tickets themselves announced that they were good for 1 round trip to Mexico City, Havana, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Trinidad, Venezuela, Rio de Janeiro, Ecuador, Peru, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and all points south via Glendale, including a stopover at Oakmont Country Club for the Carnival de los Tres Caballeros. On the afternoon of Saturday, November 18th, Mary and her housemate, Retta Scott, drove over to the Oakmont Club, which was in the foothills a few miles above the studio. Once there, they filled the ballroom with giant flowers, and an enormous piñata hung from the ceiling, a piñata that was designed to shower guests with small blossoms, not candy. Other studio artists joined them, including Hal Adelquist, a longtime Disney animator and story artist, to transform the room into a vision that radiated colorful landscapes from the film. The party not only celebrated the completion of the Three Caballeros, but was a break from the war and from general work in Hollywood. That same week, Disney was organizing screen tests to fill the lead role in The Song of the South. But all of that was put aside for the party, an event that included far more than Disney artists. It involved A-list Hollywood celebrities such as Bob Hope, Jimmy Durante, and Jack Haley, who had played the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. Attendees were encouraged to wear south-of-the-border costumes. Mary herself dressed in a braided matador's jacket, complete with string necktie, hat, and a pleated skirt that fell in folds below her knees. Others were dressed in sombreros. At least one person came as an Argentine gaucho, complete with riding pants and spurs. The costumes of the women, one reporter explained, ranged from elaborate Andean wedding dresses and ruffled Spanish gowns. One couple came as gold Aztec statues. One of the dancers wore a hat of flowers on which perched a parrot. In a letter to his sister Ruth, Walt would later write, "The boys and girls around here put on a big carnival dance last Saturday night at the Oakmont Country Club. Most of them came in Latin costumes, and there were certainly some pips on exhibition. Lily wore a simple peasant outfit and had a good time with the rest of the bunch." From photos, it's clear that Mary enjoyed herself. Another night spent with her California friends, while her husband was stationed on the East Coast. Because of the war, Mary's world was split now between Burbank and Washington, D.C. The two coasts, each with its own mood, its own sensibility. There were large projects in Mary's future, also some large decisions she'd need to make. But on this night, dressed in an elegant jacket, as though she were in a ring facing off against a bull, she allowed the festivities to swirl around her, the syncopated drum beats, the sound of guitars, and all of the colors captured in various decorations that she had experienced as one of Walt Disney's leading artists, there on 3 studio trips to Latin America. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.